I need you to pay attention to this one, because this story does not begin with a crime scene. It does not begin with police tape or a missing persons report, or the dramatic flourish of a case that the news covered breathlessly and the public consumed eagerly. It begins in the quietest place imaginable. It begins in a library. Specifically, it begins in the Millbrook Public Library, in a small town in rural Vermont, a two-story building with creaky floorboards and tall windows, and the particular smell of old books and radiator heat that belongs to libraries that have been exactly where they are for a very long time and have no intention of changing. It begins with a librarian named Margaret Holt, who had worked at the Millbrook Public Library for 31 years, and who was, by every external measure, the most trusted person in a town that placed enormous value on being trustworthy. She knew everyone. She ordered books for children based on what she remembered them saying they liked 3 visits ago. She organized the summer reading program every year without fail. She attended every town meeting. She brought casseroles to families going through difficult times. She was the kind of person that small towns produce and depend on and quietly organize themselves around. The anchor, the constant, the person who has always been there and whom everyone assumes will always be there. She retired on a Friday in June. The town gave her a party. There were flowers and a cake and a speech from the mayor and a standing ovation from the assembled community, and tears from people who had known her since they were children and who could not imagine the library without her. The following Monday, a 9-year-old girl named Lily Carson was doing a school project on people who helped the community. She decided to draw a picture of the librarian she had loved since she was old enough to hold a picture book. She sat at her kitchen table and drew Margaret Holt, the gray hair, the cardigan, the reading glasses on a chain. And then she drew the library. And inside the library, because Lily had been in every corner of it over the years and had a 9-year-old's photographic memory for places she loved, she drew a room. A room that was not on any public map of the building. A room that Lily had seen once, briefly, when she was 7 years old and had pushed open a door she wasn't supposed to push open and had looked inside for exactly 4 seconds before Margaret Holt appeared behind her, gently closed the door, and said, with a smile that was warm and entirely normal, "That's just storage, sweetheart. Nothing interesting there." Lily had believed her, because you believed Margaret Holt. Everyone believed Margaret Holt. But the drawing landed on a teacher's desk, and the teacher looked at it, and the teacher looked at it again. And then the teacher, who had grown up in Millbrook and knew the library as well as anyone, picked up the phone and called someone she trusted, and 30 years of a secret began to unravel. Stay with me, because what was in that room is not what anyone expected, and what Margaret Holt had been protecting for 30 years in plain sight in the quietest place in town is a story that will change how you think about what it means to keep a secret, and what it costs, and who pays. To understand what happened at the Millbrook Public Library, you need to understand Millbrook itself, because the town is not a backdrop to this story, it is a character in it, with all the complexity that implies. Millbrook, Vermont had a population of approximately 3,000 people, which had been approximately 3,000 people for the better part of 4 decades, give or take the seasonal fluctuations that came with the skiing industry that sustained a significant portion of the local economy between November and March. It was the kind of town where families had been for generations, where the hardware store and the diner and the pharmacy were owned by people whose grandparents had owned them before, where the select board meetings were attended by the same core group of engaged residents who had always attended them, where the social fabric was dense and interconnected in the way of small places that have had a long time to weave themselves together.
It was also, and this is the part that matters, a town with a history. In 1987, a 14-year-old girl named Clara Voss had disappeared from Millbrook on a February evening. She had been walking home from a friend's house along a route she had walked dozens of times. She had not arrived home. She had not been found. The investigation had been handled by the county sheriff's office and had produced, in the months that followed, no arrest, no confirmed evidence of what had happened, and no closure for the Voss family. Clara's parents, Howard and Patricia, and her younger brother Dean, who had lived with the open wound of not knowing for 3 decades. The case had never been formally closed. It had never been solved. It existed in Millbrook the way unresolved things exist in small towns, present in the community's consciousness, surfacing periodically when someone mentioned it, or when Dean Voss, who had stayed in Millbrook and become a carpenter, and who was now 41 years old, was visible around town, and people thought about his family, and felt the particular helpless sorrow of a community that had failed to protect one of its own. Margaret Holt had been 29 years old in 1987. She had already been at the library for 3 years. She had known Clara Voss, had known all the children, the way librarians know all the children. Clara had been a reader. She loved mysteries, specifically the Agatha Christie novels that Margaret had ordered for the library's young adult section, and that Clara had worked through systematically, one by one, with the focused pleasure of a reader who had found exactly what they were looking for. Margaret had attended the vigils after Clara disappeared. She had brought a casserole to the Voss home. She had done all the things that Millbrook did for its grieving families. And she had, for 30 years, said nothing about what she knew. Lily Carson was 9 years old and possessed of the specific artistic gift of a child who draws what she actually sees, rather than what she thinks things are supposed to look like. Her drawings were detailed and spatially accurate in a way that her teacher, Miss Patricia Webb, had noted in parent-teacher conferences as unusual for her age. She has a kind of visual memory that is genuinely remarkable.
The school project was called People Who Help Our Community and was due on a Wednesday. Lily had chosen Margaret Holt without hesitation. She had spent Monday evening at her kitchen table with her colored pencils and a large sheet of white paper, constructing the drawing with the methodical care of someone who is trying to get something exactly right. She drew the library exterior first, the 2-story building, the steps, the sign above the door. Then the interior, the main reading room, the children's section with its low shelves and beanbag chairs, the tall windows. Then Margaret herself, seated at the reference desk in her characteristic cardigan, glasses on the chain around her neck, a book open in front of her. Then, because Lily was thorough and because she had always been curious about it and had thought about those 4 seconds many times in the 2 years since she had accidentally opened the door, she drew the back hallway. And at the end of the back hallway, she drew a door. And beyond the door, rendered in the way that children render the insides of rooms they have glimpsed briefly, from the compressed information of 4 seconds of looking, she drew what she had seen. Shelves, boxes, papers, a desk with a lamp. And on the wall, drawn with the particular attention that Lily brought to things she found visually striking, what appeared to be a large map covered in pins, strings, and small pieces of paper. The kind of thing you see in detective films. The kind of thing that, in detective films, means someone has been working on something for a very long time. Miss Webb received the drawing on Wednesday morning. She put it with the other projects on her desk and intended to look through them during her lunch break. She got to Lily's drawing at approximately 12:23 p.m. and held it in her hands for a moment longer than she held the others. She had grown up in Millbrook. She had been in the Millbrook Public Library hundreds of times over the course of her 38 years. She knew the building the way you know places you have visited since childhood, in her bones, in her feet, in the muscle memory of navigation. She knew where every room was. She knew the back hallway. She knew the door at the end of it.
She had always been told it was storage. She sat with Lily's drawing for a long time. Then she called her older sister, who was married to a man who worked for the county sheriff's office, and asked her to pass something along. What investigators found when they entered the back room of the Millbrook Public Library on a Thursday morning, 3 days after Lily Carson submitted her drawing, was not what any of them had prepared themselves to find. It was not a crime scene. There was no body, no contraband, no evidence of anything illegal in the conventional sense. What it was a 30-year investigation. Margaret Holt had been conducting a private investigation into the disappearance of Clara Voss since 1991, 4 years after Clara vanished, when Margaret had become convinced that the official investigation had missed something critical and that she was the only person in a position to find it. The room contained 30 years of meticulous, organized, cross-referenced work, binders organized by year, maps of the route Clara had walked, annotated with notes about visibility, traffic patterns, properties along the way, photographs, not crime scene photographs, but her own photographs, taken over years, documenting changes to properties and people and the physical landscape of Millbrook, a timeline running along one wall, a long piece of butcher paper covered in dates and events and names and questions, updated regularly, the oldest entries faded, and the most recent ones in fresh ink, and a thick folder at the center of the desk, the folder that investigators would spend 3 days reading, labeled in Margaret's careful handwriting with 2 words, "What I Know." Margaret had been a librarian for 31 years. She understood research. She understood the accumulation and organization of information. She understood that the difference between a question and an answer was usually not a matter of intelligence, but a matter of having access to the right sources and the patience to cross-reference them properly. She had applied these skills, the skills of her entire professional life, to the question of what had happened to Clara Voss, And in the folder labeled What I Know, she had assembled an account that was not a proof, not a legal case, not the kind of thing that could walk into a courtroom and produce a verdict, but it was something. It was the most complete picture of what had happened on that February evening in 1987 that had ever been assembled, and at its center was a name that Margaret had arrived at through 30 years of patient, methodical, library-skilled research, a name that she had not taken to the police.
Because the name was Sheriff Ray Dunbar. Ray Dunbar had been the Hartwell County Sheriff from 1984 to 2009. He had led the investigation into Clara Voss's disappearance. He had been the face of the official response, the press conferences, the community updates, the expressions of commitment to finding the truth. He had retired to a house on the edge of Millbrook. He was 71 years old. He attended the same church as half the town. His daughter had been in the same class as Clara Voss. His daughter had also been the friend whose house Clara was walking home from on the night she disappeared. Let us pause here for just a moment. Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. And if you are new here, welcome home. If this story is already in your chest, if Margaret is already sitting with you, if that room full of 30 years of quiet work is already sitting with you, then you are exactly who this channel was built for. Hit subscribe right now, because tomorrow I am releasing another story just as powerful as this one, and you do not want to miss it. Every single day, new story, real stakes, always worth your time. Drop your location in the comments. I read every single one. Now, back to Margaret, back to the room, back to what 30 years of a librarian's patience finally produced. Margaret Holt had not started investigating Clara Voss's disappearance out of suspicion of Ray Dunbar. She had started investigating because she was a librarian, and she could not accept that the answer did not exist somewhere. That was her fundamental professional belief, applied to the most painful question her community had ever faced. The answer existed. It was somewhere. It needed to be found. She had begun in 1991 by doing what she did every day in her professional life, organizing information. She had gathered everything publicly available about the disappearance: newspaper accounts, the public statements from the sheriff's office, the community timeline as she remembered it. She had interviewed, not formally, but in the natural course of her daily interactions, as a librarian who knew everyone and who people talked to freely, the people who had known Clara, who had lived along her route, who had been in Millbrook that February evening.
What she had found in those first years was a series of small inconsistencies, things that did not align properly, small gaps between what the official account said and what the people she spoke to remembered. None of them were dramatic, none of them were individually significant, but they accumulated, the way things accumulate in a library, not in a single important book, but in the aggregate of many small things that together tell a story that no single one of them tells alone. The most significant inconsistency was this. Ray Dunbar's official report stated that Clara had left his daughter Emma's house at 7:15 p.m. 3 people who had been in the vicinity of the Dunbar property that evening, a neighbor walking a dog, a delivery driver making a late run, a teenager who had been visiting a friend nearby, had independently told Margaret, in conversations spread across the first 5 years of her investigation, that they had seen Clara leaving the Dunbar property later than 7:15. One had said 7:45, one had said approximately 8, one had said close to 8. I remember because I was thinking about the news. 30 minutes. The difference between 7:15 and 7:45 was 30 minutes. But those 30 minutes were significant because the window of time in which Clara had disappeared was precisely that window, the gap between when she was last confirmed seen and when she should have arrived home. If she had left the Dunbar house at 7:45 rather than 7:15, the timeline of the investigation was wrong. The route options were different, the window of opportunity was different, and Ray Dunbar, who had told the investigators, who had been the investigators, had controlled the information from the beginning. Margaret had spent 5 years confirming this discrepancy through sources she trusted. She had spent the next 5 years building the larger picture around it, the financial records she had found through public document requests that showed irregularities in property transactions in Millbrook in the late 1980s, the connections she had traced between Ray Dunbar and a developer who had purchased land along Clara's route in 1989, the specific parcel of land that had been cleared and developed in the summer of 1988, 6 months after Clara disappeared, and that had required, she had found this in the building permits, significant excavation.
She had never gone to the police, because the police were Ray Dunbar's colleagues, his friends.
his successors who had been trained by him. And she had understood, with the quiet realism of a woman who had lived in a small town her entire life, that walking into the Hartwell County Sheriff's Office with a folder full of accumulated evidence against a former sheriff was not something that would be received in the spirit in which it was offered. She had waited. She had kept working. She had kept adding to the folder. She had waited until Ray Dunbar retired, until the people who reported to him cycled out, until the sheriff's office had people in it who had not been his. She had been almost ready, had told herself that the following spring she would make the call, would find the right investigator, and would bring the folder out of the room into the light. And then she had retired, and Lily Carson had done a school project, and the room had been found before she could control how it was found. Margaret Holt was contacted by investigators on Thursday evening after the room was discovered. She was 71 years old. She had been home for 4 days since her retirement party, tending her garden and reading the novels she had been accumulating on her nightstand for years and not yet had time for. She opened her front door and saw the investigators, and she said very calmly, "I've been expecting someone. Come in, I'll make tea." She sat with them for 4 hours. She answered every question. She walked them through 30 years of her investigation with the methodical clarity of someone who has been organizing information for their entire professional life and who has been preparing for this conversation, in some form, for a very long time. She explained the timeline discrepancy. She explained the land transactions. She explained every connection in the folder. She explained why she had not come forward sooner. She said, "I know how this looks. I know it looks like I was hoarding something, like I was making a unilateral decision about what justice looked like for Clara's family. I have thought about that for 30 years. I have not come to peace with it. What I came to was this. I did not have proof. I had a picture."
A detailed, carefully assembled picture. But a picture is not proof. And taking a picture to an institution that was run by the person at the center of it was not going to produce proof. It was going to produce the destruction of the picture. I chose to keep working until I had something that couldn't be destroyed. I ran out of time before I got there. She paused. The thing I regret most is not telling Dean Voss, Clara's brother. He deserved to know that someone was looking, that someone had been looking his whole adult life. I told myself it would be cruel to give him hope I couldn't yet fulfill. I think I was wrong about that. I think I was protecting myself as much as I was protecting him. That is what I carry. The investigation that followed Margaret's folder took 14 months. It involved the state police, federal investigators, and forensic archaeologists who spent 3 weeks examining the parcel of land along Clara's route that had been developed in 1988. It was slow and careful, and conducted with the awareness that the evidence was old, and the subject was 71 years old, and that the legal pathway to accountability was narrow but real. What the archaeologists found in the 3rd week confirmed what Margaret had suspected for 30 years. What the financial investigation confirmed regarding Ray Dunbar's connection to the developer and the land transactions confirmed the motive. What the re-interviews of the 3 witnesses who had given Margaret the timeline discrepancy, all of whom were still alive, all of whom confirmed their original accounts, confirmed was that the original investigation had been deliberately misdirected from the beginning. Ray Dunbar was arrested 14 months after Lily Carson submitted her drawing for a school project. He was 71 years old. He said nothing when the handcuffs were put on. He looked, witnesses said, like a man who had been waiting for a long time for something he had hoped would never come, and who had understood at some level that hope was always going to be insufficient. Dean Voss was 41 years old when the investigators knocked on his door. He was in his workshop, building a kitchen cabinet for a client in the next town over, doing the work he had been doing for 20 years in the town he had never left, because leaving felt like abandoning something he couldn't name and couldn't afford to abandon. The investigator who told him was a woman named Sarah Okafor, who had been specifically chosen for the notification because of her experience with cold case family notifications and her understanding of what it means to deliver information that is simultaneously the answer to a 30-year prayer and the confirmation of the worst thing that could be true. She sat with Dean in his workshop. She told him what had been found. She told him what it meant. She told him about the folder, about the woman who had been working for 30 years in a back room at the library. Dean Voss sat very still for a long time after she finished. Then he said, "Margaret Holt knew?" Sarah said, "She was investigating for 30 years." Dean was quiet again. Then he said, "She came to my parents' house with a casserole after Clara. She sat with my mother. She held my mother's hand." Sarah said, "Yes." Dean said, "She was already investigating then?" Sarah said, "She started a few years later, but she was already paying attention." Dean sat with this.
Then he said something that Sarah Okafor has quoted in every conversation she has had about this case since, because it was the truest thing said by anyone in the entire 14 months. He said, "I wish she had told me. I understand why she didn't. I wish she had anyway. Not because it would have changed anything, but because I spent 30 years thinking nobody was looking. I could have known that somebody was. That would have been worth something. That would have been worth a lot." He asked to speak to Margaret Holt. Margaret agreed immediately. What passed between them in that conversation is private. What Dean has said publicly, in a brief statement he released the month after Ray Dunbar's arrest, is this: "A woman spent 30 years of her life looking for my sister in a back room of the library. She did it alone, and she did it carefully, and she did it because she was a librarian, and she believed the answer was somewhere, and she was going to find it. She found most of it. The rest we found together. I am not going to spend any time being angry at her for not telling me sooner. I am going to spend the time I have left being grateful that she looked." He asked to speak to Margaret Holt.
Lily Carson was told in an age-appropriate way that her drawing had helped solve a very old mystery. Her parents explained it to her carefully, not the details, not the darkness, but the essential truth that something she had seen and remembered and drawn had mattered. Lily, who was 9 years old and whose relationship to the world was characterized by the particular clarity of a child who notices things and draws what she sees, thought about this for a moment. Then she said, "I knew that room was important. I always thought it was important. I just didn't know why." Her teacher, Miss Webb, who had made the call that started everything, said something that she has since shared in a talk she gave at a regional education conference about the value of children's observations and the importance of taking them seriously. She said, "Lily drew what she saw. She didn't decide at first whether it was important. She didn't filter it through what an adult would consider worth drawing. She drew the whole building, including the room that didn't officially exist, because she had seen it and it was part of her experience of the place she loved. The lesson for me, as a teacher, as an adult, is that children see things we filter out. They see things because they haven't yet learned to decide that certain things aren't worth seeing. That is not a limitation. That is a gift, and we should be paying attention to it." Lily went back to the library the following year, the newly reopened library, under new management, with a new librarian who was young and enthusiastic, and who had grown up in Vermont but not in Millbrook, and who carried none of the weight of what the building had held for 30 years. Lily found her usual spot in the children's section. She found the beanbag chair she preferred. She found a book she had not read yet. She did not go to the back hallway. She did not push open any doors. She sat in her beanbag chair with her book and read until her mother came to pick her up, and the library was the library again, full of books and warmth and the particular smell of old pages and radiator heat. Exactly what it had always been, and also now, something more.
Margaret Holt was not charged with any crime. The investigation found no legal basis for charges. She had conducted a private investigation, kept private records, and made a personal decision about when and how to bring her findings forward. None of this was criminal. Some of it was arguably a moral failure. She was the first to say so. She gave one interview to a journalist she had known since the journalist was a child who checked out library books on Saturdays. She chose this journalist specifically, she said, because she wanted to be understood by someone who knew her whole story, not just the part that happened in the back room. She said, "I have thought about whether I was wrong to keep it in that room for as long as I did. I think the honest answer is, partly. I was right to keep working when the work needed doing and the institution designed to do it was compromised. I was wrong to keep it from Dean. Those are both true. I can hold both of them." She was asked what 30 years of secret investigation had cost her. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Every time I saw Howard and Patricia Voss at the grocery store, or at a town meeting, or at church, every time I saw Dean, I carried what I knew and they didn't know I was carrying it. That is a heavy thing. You get used to the weight, but getting used to weight is not the same as the weight being gone. It was always there. I just learned to stand up straight under it." She was asked if she would do it again. She said, "I would do it differently. I would find a way to tell Dean sooner. I would find an investigator outside the county to bring the folder to earlier. I made choices that I thought were the safest choices for the information, and I think some of them were wrong.
But would I keep looking? Yes, always. Because the alternative was knowing and doing nothing. And I am a librarian. I have never believed in knowing and doing nothing. That is the one part I would not change. She went back to her garden. She finished the novels on her nightstand.
She went to the library sometimes, as a patron, as a reader, as the woman who had worked there for 31 years and who had always belonged to the building in some way that no retirement party could fully sever. She sometimes sat in the children's section, in the beanbag chairs, with a book. She thought about Clara Voss when she sat there. She thought about Clara's love of Agatha Christie, about the mysteries she had worked through systematically, one by one, about the focused pleasure of a reader who has found exactly what they were looking for. She thought Clara would have solved it faster. She believed this. She smiled when she thought about it. This story is about a room in a library, but it is about much more than that. It is about what happens when the institution designed to produce justice is the institution that produced the injustice, when the person who led the investigation was the person who needed to be investigated. About the specific, terrible position of someone who knows something and understands that the channels available for knowing things are not safe channels, and who must decide alone what to do with what they know. It is about patience as a form of justice, about 30 years of careful, organized, methodical work done in a back room by a woman with no authority and no resources except the skills of her profession and the refusal to accept that the answer did not exist somewhere. About the specific contribution of a librarian, a person whose entire professional life is organized around the belief that information exists and can be found, and that finding it and organizing it and making it accessible is the most important work a person can do to the cause of truth. It is about Dean Voss, who spent 30 years thinking nobody was looking, who sat in his workshop building things with his hands and living in his town and carrying the specific weight of a loss that was never explained, and who found out on a Thursday morning that someone had been looking the whole time, that the looking had mattered, that the answer had been in a back room all along. And it is about Lily Carson, 9 years old, a child with a gift for seeing what is actually there and drawing it without deciding first whether it is important,
who drew a room because she had seen it and it was part of her experience of a place she loved, who handed a drawing to a teacher on a Wednesday morning and set 30 years of quiet work free. This is the thing that Carol Briggs would recognize, that Diana Flores would recognize, that Ruth Pacheco would recognize, that every person in every story on this channel who noticed something and finally said something would recognize it. You never know what you are carrying until someone helps you understand its weight. You never know when the thing you noticed, the room, the 7 words, the timestamp, the letter, is the thing that changes everything. Notice, say so, let someone else carry it with you. That is all. That is everything. If this story found you tonight, if Margaret found you, if Lily's drawing found you, if Dean in his workshop found you, then you already know why this channel exists. We tell the stories of those who live in quiet places, in the back rooms of libraries, in the drawings of 9-year-olds, in the 30-year patience of people who refuse to accept that the answer did not exist somewhere. If that matters to you, subscribe right now. New story every single day. Each one told the way this one was, fully, carefully, with every person's name on it. Like this video for Margaret, who stood up straight under 30 years of wait. For Dean, who spent those years thinking nobody was looking. For Lily, who drew what she saw without deciding first whether it was important. The algorithm responds to your like. Let it respond for them. Share this video with the person in your life who is carrying something they do not know what to do with the teacher, with the librarian, with the person who noticed something and has not yet said so. Comment below. Tell me which moment stopped you. Tell me about the room. Tell me about Dean's words. Tell me about Lily drawing what she saw. Thank you for being here. Thank you for paying attention. The answer is somewhere. It always is. Keep looking.